Well, hello, and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Norwalk Community College. This is Bio 211. This is one of the sections at the community college. And what we're going to cover now is Chapter 6. We're going to break it up into two parts, the entire chapter. But when we think about what bone is, by now hopefully you've read the chapter, and now I'm going to sort of narrate how you process some of the information that you've actually read. And generally speaking, everybody understands that, the function of bone is to participate in a skeletal system. So all of these bones have unique shapes, they articulate in unique ways, and together they now allow you to have responsibility in locomotion, or have responsibility in, say, what do we got? Calcium homeostasis. You'll see how Mother Nature prepares the body for things like blood and nerve supply for bone. Meaning, even though most people think of bones as these rather inert structures, they're actually very, very vascularized. And one of the reasons for that is you make what are called the formed elements. These are the red blood cells and the white blood cells. And they have to actually exit bone. So it has to be highly vascularized. And should anything ever happen to your bones, your brain needs to know about it, because bone is essentially very, very stable calcium salt, and that calcium salt is very sharp when it breaks. So that means it would open up blood vessels if that was the case. So here's a list. We're going to cover the structure of bone, the histology of bone tissue, meaning what are the cells that are actually responsible for that. How do we actually have bone formation? What are the major types of bone formation? And a moment ago I mentioned its role in calcium homeostasis. At this point in time in the course, you've seen calcium in countless, well, not literally countless, but in very important regulatory roles. So Mother Nature's figured out, well, if I have a reservoir of it inside of bone, well, I can access that quickly. You also have changes in bone as a result of exercise, and of course increasing amounts of exercise increase the amount of muscle tone, and all of that. We'll figure out what's going on with that. Excuse me. We don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about aging in bone, but in the process of bone formation and bone's dynamic changes in our lifetime, some of those changes are reversed as you age. So that's something to pay attention to. When you're reading the text, what I want to make sure you're doing is you're thinking about bone's role in the skeletal system for support, protection, how locomotion occurs, what is it about creating lever systems that's required, how we use hormones to regulate homeostasis for calcium levels inside the bloodstream. We don't talk a whole lot about it. In fact, it gets its own chapter inside AMP2, but I told you a moment ago, well, if we're going to make formed elements, we have to understand how they can get in and get out of bone. And then finally, at the end, as we age, we actually make yellow marrow. Okay? And that is stored inside of the diaphyses, the long portions of bones. And that has both positive and negative consequences. Okay? Let's take a look a little bit more at what support is. Support is that structural framework of the body. It supports the soft tissues, both inside and out, and provides attachment points for tendons of skeletal muscle. Okay, I should also put inside here ligaments. Ligament, yes. Okay. When we're speaking about protection, protection is pretty straightforward. It's protection of internal organs, but it's also protection of the developing red blood cells or formed elements inside of bone. Cranium obviously protects the brain, vertebrae protect the spinal cord, ribs protect your lungs and your heart. Everything else is pretty much deep to skin and you'd say vulnerable. Okay? When we're thinking about its role in assistance in movement, remember what's going to happen is skeletal muscle pulls on bone producing movements. Well, just a moment ago we told you it's not actually pulling on bone. In fact, what it's doing, it's the tendons are pulling on bone, and we'll figure out how they're assembled when we talk about how it is we actually build musculature. More importantly, you'll notice I have 3 asterisks here for mineral homeostasis. I want to make sure you're paying attention to this, because this is going to be our our entry examination into endocrinology inside the body. And if you pay attention close enough, you'll be able to carry this information with you into AMP2, where it'll be very helpful. But essentially what we do is we have a reservoir, and that reservoir is calcium and phosphate. So inside my notes here I have it saying calcium and phosphorus. Okay, what I want to make sure you get is that it is a reservoir, which means cells in the body will either access it, or meaning access it to release into your circulatory system, or they will remove it from your plasma of your blood to store it into the actual matrix of bone itself. Okay, moving on, thinking about blood cell production. This is called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. And remember, I called these guys all formed elements, so I'm just going to put Fe here. Fe. And in AMP2, you get to learn formed elements. You get to learn how all these things are made. And we go all the way back to, progenitor cells, where each has a specific life history, and each has a specific responsibility. And good for you. You don't necessarily need to know it right now, but I want to make sure you're thinking to yourself, how can Mother Nature have hemopoiesis inside of bone? What are the spaces that afford this opportunity? Okay. Now, the last piece on this is triglyceride storage, and just by way of triglyceride storage and knowing that your final exam, look at that, final exam, formed elements, is coming up. Triglyceride storage, of course, is what, 3 carbons, yay, that actually have fatty acids attached to them, yay. Remember, those fatty acids have weird names, yay. Okay, so it actually makes sense that you understand the type of chemical reaction that was required to do this. Right, so these are dehydration synthesis reactions that attach the fatty acid to our 3-carbon glycerol backbone. That's review for your exam, general knowledge, but also as we age, we store it as adipose tissue inside of our bone, and it serves as a chemical energy reserve. Okay, so we're going to transition now. And what I mean by that is, now that I've given you sort of the function of bone, let's take a look at the structure of long bones. Okay, and there are many types of bones inside of the body, but I want you to pay attention to the general, I say many, 4 or 5 types of bone. The structural characteristics of the long bone encapsulate everything for bone to function in the body, though. So that's why we use it inside your textbook as a sort of basic introduction. Okay, so let's get out of the cartoon piece there. Wham. Let's go over here, and you're going to see that long bone, so this is a humerus. Okay, it's a specific part of it's a specific bone inside the body, and I say humerus, and you should be able to point to it. Okay, and you can see that in these brackets, we actually tell you how to describe the location of the bone itself. So if this is an entire long bone, we break it up into epiphyses, both proximal and distal. We have metaphyses. Notice we're not telling you proximal or distal, but it should make sense. And then we have a diaphyses. So in other words, these are the heads of the bone, and this is the shaft of the bone, and this is the joining part, where you actually have this thing that's called an epiphyseal line. And that epiphyseal line is where we once had a growth plate inside this bone when it was a little bit less mature. At the ends, you're going to see in blue here, you have articular cartilage, and that articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. So we know what hyaline cartilage is. Chapter 4. I'm just going to put an HY there, if I can get the pen to work. Hyaline cartilage. Okay, and that hyaline cartilage is a unique type of cartilage, and we know it's mainly collagen, and it's now allowing for the articulating ends of bones to interact with one another without traumatizing the bone tissue. But notice it has a specific name. It is hyaline cartilage that is referred to as articular cartilage. Surrounding bone, okay, right up into the articular cartilage piece, on the outermost portion is this thing that's called a periosteum. And I have it listed for you here. That periosteum actually is a fibrous connective tissue that actually will have progenitor cells, cells that allow for bone growth to happen here, okay, as well as blood vessels to pass through them, but also to reduce the likelihood that something can actually harm the solid structure of bone inside there. Your bones are light, relatively speaking, and that's because they actually have this thing that's called a medullary cavity, and lining the medullary cavity is the endosteum. So peri is around the diaphysis, endosteum lines the medullary cavity inside the diaphysis. Okay? Fancy words, but you got to make sure you know how to employ them. Okay, so let's get rid of the cartoon. Let's go over here. How is bone actually made up? Well, bone is essentially a matrix, and a matrix of calcium phosphate salts. It's a mineral salt. Okay, so it means these are what type of bonds? I'm going to say ionic, and they can be broken apart by acids, which is going to be really important. Okay, not sure why we're getting that swinging ball of death there. Cancel. Okay, I don't like when that stuff like that happens. Okay, extracellular matrix is going to be made up of primarily water. There's collagen fibers between it, and it's mainly crystallized mineral salts. And the water, of course, is space. You are a bag of salt water. The collagen fibers are what gives bone its what we're going to call tensile strength. This is why when you actually hit bone, it doesn't crumble underneath the force. Enough of a force, obviously, that will break the tensile strength. But even then, okay, it's not like it's going to snap like a piece of chalk. Okay. Now, to actually build bone, we actually go through this process. It's called calcification, and that's because bone-building cells, which are osteoblasts, which should make sense, right? Osteoblasts are progenitor cells that will deposit those mineral salts around that collagen, okay, to actually make up the tensile strength of bone, okay? And if you don't have collagen, well, the tensile strength and flexibility of bone is compromised. And one way to think about this is if we took collagen out of your diet, your bones would become brittle. If we took the ability to, how do I say this? If we took the ability to process collagen properly, it isn't your bones become brittle, is that the ability to withstand the force of gravity is lost. And if you take a look at somebody who has a poor collagen diet or doesn't process collagen properly, their knees are bowed. You could see where literally the force lines through the bone itself are compromised. Okay, so if that's what osteoblasts are doing, osteoblasts, okay, drive calcification, okay, we actually have osteogenic cells, because there are 4 types of cells that are present inside of bone. And remember a moment ago I told you about that periosteal membrane. In one location of your actual bone, you'll have that periosteal membrane, and it will have osteogenic cells that undergo cell division, right? And once they've undergone cell division, they're now osteoblasts. And those osteoblasts build the extracellular matrix that sit around the osteoblasts while they're building it. Okay? And what happens is the osteoblasts literally trap themselves inside of a lacuna, and we call these now mature bone cells. So mature bone cells in lacuna. Lacunae. That doesn't look right, but lacunae. Anyway, A-E-E-A, whatever. And what's going to happen here is these guys are very much alive. They're very much alive inside these lacuna, and they're exchanging nutrients and waste with blood, meaning that interstitial fluid that's surrounding them. And what's even more interesting is all the osteocytes, they actually have processes that stretch off of themselves, and that they actually are in contact with one another, and that's actually how they communicate. Okay, the last set of cells I want to tell you about are these things that are called osteoclasts. And osteoclasts release enzymes that digest the mineral components of blood, and they raise the calcium blood level, meaning if they're activated, they use enzymes, and I don't know why I left this out, sorry about that, hydrochloric acid, okay, which then digests and will return now into the bloodstream calcium and phosphate. So you can see what's going to happen here. If osteoblasts take calcium and phosphate out of the bloodstream, osteoclasts take calcium and phosphate out of bone, and you have this dynamic. And now this gets me to draw this cartoon. And hopefully this makes sense to you now, and I don't even need to explain it. You could demonstrate which one would be doing what to the calcium concentration inside your bloodstream. So let's get rid of that cartoon. Let's go over here. Let's think about the different types of bone. And I'm going to introduce these and then we'll just stop. Okay, so there's compact bone, which resists the stress produced by weight and movement. Okay, and they do this because they create repeating structural systems. Okay, and what you need to do is we need to figure out how you're going to learn how to build osteons. Okay, you'll also hear I call them haversion systems because they have a haversion or central canal that is arranged with lamella around this osteon. Okay, here is the actual structure. I'll show you the picture in a minute. Okay, so because this doesn't actually make sense. Osteons have a central canal that runs longitudinally through bone. Think about that for a moment. Longitudinally. Okay. Around the central canals and concentric lamella, meaning you're going to have a repeated array of these lamella, and they're making up rings, sort of like a tree, but not in the same way. You'll see why I clarify that. And what's going to happen is inside these lamella are going to be these spaces that have these lacuna. I did spell it right, yay. A-E. And they have those osteocytes, the mature osteoblasts that are now trapped in that space. And they use canaliculi to contact one another, meaning they send processes from themselves to each of the other adjacent osteocytes. And to see that, that's what you have here. This is an osteon, and inside of the concentric lamella, you have these lacuna, and inside the lacuna you have an osteocyte, and these are the processes off of that osteocyte, and where you actually have the canaliculi that are traveling through those spaces. So it's the processes off of this that travel in the canaliculi. And notice what's happening here. You have that fibrous outer layer with that inner osteogenic layer, and they're making osteoblasts that are going to trap themselves in a calcium phosphate matrix. And then they create these osteons around blood vessels. Literally, they pull the blood vessel in there with them. That's why understanding how blood vessels work inside bone is really important, right? So now you move inward and you see these repeating arrays, and this is what allows Mother Nature to transmit force against gravity through your body. Okay. Now, the other type of bone is this thing that's called spongy bone, and you're going to notice immediately that there is no central canal, and therefore it's not a lacuna, and therefore we call it trabeculae. And these trabeculae are used to create spongy bone, and that spongy bone is found in unique locations in different bone types. But what's most important is that notice there's an apparent lack of vasculature here. That would be false for you to think that. For whatever reason, the artist did not remind you that inside this space you have interstitial fluid that is surrounding all of these cells, and diffusion is what's going to allow these cells to survive. Okay, so spongy bone lacks that osteon, but it still has lamella, and it has that thin lattice of trabecular structures. And what's going to happen is in the space between these is where blood cell production is going to occur. Okay, so just to summarize this first part, okay, I want you to realize what we've done is we've introduced what bone can do in terms of function descriptively, and what we've done is we've gone about beginning to build bone by introducing the basic structure of long bone, and also we went about describing if we're looking at compact bone versus spongy bone, or haversion systems and trabecular systems, you're going to see that there is a physical difference between them. And when we actually come back, we'll pick up with spongy bone to say how we're going to now use this to build different types of bone. Okay? Bye for now.